Welcome back to another Tactical Fly Fisher video. Thanks for watching. In our last video, we talked about how to know when your flies are at the right depth when you're making nymph drifts. Adding on to that, now we need to talk about how you adjust your depth so that you then get in that right zone. So I've got 8 steps here for you. Let's go through them and hopefully they'll help you make the adjustments you need to help you catch more fish. Number 1, the easiest way to affect how deep your flies get is to cast closer or further from your target. This is pretty self-explanatory, but the closer you cast to your target, the less sink time you have before you get to your target lie, the shallower your flies are going to be. If you cast further above that target, you have more sink time, and theoretically, the deeper your flies can get. So that's one way to adjust for depth. Number 2, change the angle of the entry of your cast. So if I want my flies to sink quicker, I can use a tuck cast where I stop that cast up in the sky, my leader turns over abruptly and then fires down vertically, and it releases the tension on my tippet, and the trajectory of my fly is down, so the combination of those two things makes it so that my fly sinks quicker and I get down deeper. But, newsflash, this just in, you can be too deep, too deep, too deep, too deep. Barbara, back to you in the studio. You can be too deep. So, one easy way to also account for that is to then make a cast that's more horizontal. So instead, the opposite of the tuck cast would be make your cast with a little bit lower rod tip angle where you stop, and then your leader will turn over more horizontally, and the full profile of that tippet will have to sink through the water, which decreases your sink rate and the amount of depth that you can achieve with that cast. The third step, think about your tippet size. Thinner tippet sinks quicker. There's no doubt about it. Go fish some 5X, step it down to 6, step it down to 7, with the same flies, same drifts, same casting, same length, same everything, and you will get deeper with that 7X. Now, obviously, you have to deal with what's responsible for the fish and is considerate of your own personal abilities, but thinner tippet's going to sink quicker, thicker tippet is going to sink slower. Factor that into your sink rate when you're thinking about your nymph drifts. Number 4, tippet length. Going along with your tippet size, obviously your tippet length is going to affect how deep you can get as well. This is another pretty self-explanatory one, but if you have a longer tippet, you're going to be able to get deeper. Shorter tippet is going to reduce that terminal depth that you can reach. Start somewhere around 1.5 to 2 times the average depth of the water that you think you're going to fish. Then make adjustments from there if you need to. That tippet length is something that should enter your head that I think a lot of people who are Euro-nymphing kind of leave static and don't think about as far as a depth adjustment goes. Number 5, change the angle of your sighter. If I make my cast and I keep my sighter angle horizontal like this, so it comes in at a really shallow angle, pretty close to horizontal on the water, I'm putting a lot of downstream pressure on my rig when I fish the leader that way. That downstream pressure adds tension and lifts your flies up off the bottom. So you're not going to be able to get as deep when you're putting a whole bunch of downstream leading on your flies. On the contrary, if you slow everything down, allow your sighter to get to a more vertical angle under your rod tip, and then you track with your rod tip at that vertical angle, then your flies are at a little more of a dead drift speed. You release that tension and they can get deeper. Changing that angle of the sighter will help you adjust for depth without having to make other changes as well. So it's another tool in your toolbox to affect how deep your flies can get. Number 6, think about the butt section of your Euro leader. So one of the things I've harped on a lot over the last several years is fishing thinner and thinner leaders. So I fish what I often refer to as a micro leader, and that leader has a butt section of around 4x diameter. With that really thin butt section, there's not a lot of mass in the back end of the leader. So when I fish it out away from the rod tip, that mass doesn't sag or succumb to gravity and kind of pull back under the rod tip. At least not nearly as much as if I had a thicker leader with more mass. You can get to a greater depth with less weight with that micro leader than you can if you have a thicker butt section. Because the reverse of that is if you have a thicker butt section, it has more mass in the back end of that leader, and it's going to sag back toward the rod tip, and you have to fish more weight to counteract that sag if you want to keep it out away from the rod tip and get to a certain depth. The caveat to what I just said is that it really only applies to drifts where you're holding the sighter off the water. Sometimes a thicker butt section is actually a help when you're thinking about presentations with the floated cider, but that's another topic for another video. Number 7, think about the body materials on your fly. This is one that I don't think a lot of anglers think about. They think about just the weight that's in the fly, but not how it's constructed. Let's break our nymphs into 4 categories and think about how the body is constructed and then how that affects their sink rate. So your fastest sink rate category, those are going to be your perdigons. There's a reason why they're designed the way they're designed. If you translate it from Spanish to English, it means pellet. They sink like a pellet because they have a smooth body of resin on the outside and nothing stops their sink rate. There's not a lot of surface area that slows it down. Number 2 would be a little bit slower sink rate than a perdigon, and those are nymphs that have some sort of dubbing on it. That could be just a dubbing collar. It could even be like a perdigon body with some dubbing collar on it. Or it could be a full dubbing bodied fly like a waltz worm or a hare's ear. Or it could also be something that just has some feathers on it, like a pheasant tail. Fibers that grab a little bit of water that slow the sink rate down just a little bit compared to a smooth-bodied perdigon. The 3rd category would be flies that sink a little bit slower still, would be flies that have soft tackles on them. It's all about surface area once again. If you have a dubbing-bodied fly and then you add soft tackle to it, you've got a whole bunch of extra surface area that those fibers from the soft tackle grab, and as they're grabbing all that water on the sink and moving around and looking nice, they also slow your sink rate. Some people might think that's a bad thing, but in certain instances, it's a good thing, and it's one more way that you can make micro adjustments to your sink rate and thereby your depth without having to change the bead size of your fly. And then the last sink rate, the slowest types of flies, would be something like a mop. If you look at a mop, it's nothing but interstitial spaces. It catches a lot of water on the drop and slows it down. Or if you had a fly that had tons of rubber legs, a palmered hackle, something like that, lots and lots of fibers or stuff to catch water, that's going to slow your sink rate down even more. So you can use those different sink rate categories within your nymphs to tailor micro adjustments in your sink rate without adjusting the weight of your flies. Number 8, the last one. Once you've factored all the previous variables that I've gone through in this list into your depth adjustment, think about the weight of the fly. That's usually the last thing I make a change because it's the only one where I actually have to clip off a fly and retie. I can't just adjust the length of my cast, adjust the trajectory of my cast, things like that. I physically have to make a change by clipping off a fly. So once I've thought about everything else, made the changes that I can do without it, I will clip off the fly and change the bead size to either be smaller or bigger, depending upon whether I need faster or slower sink rates. What goes along with that is you can also change the type of bead to get micro adjustments within that as well. Our slotted beads that we sell in the shop are a little bit lighter than our inverting beads in the same general size because there's more of the bead cut out so that it can get over the hook. I often tie my favorite flies in both inverting and slotted beads so that I get micro adjustments in weight. And then I can think about that little bit extra or a little bit less that I need weight-wise to get the exact sink rate that I want with the same pattern that I'm already using. So in summary, if you want to be able to adjust your depth and your sink rate, number 1, cast further or closer to your target. Number 2, use a tuck cast to get deeper or a horizontal cast to stay shallower. Number 3, use thinner tippet to sink faster or thicker tippet to sink slower. Number 4, have longer tippet to get deeper or shorter tippet to stay shallower. Number 5, change the angle of your cider. A more shallow cider angle is going to keep your flies shallower. A more vertical cider angle is going to let your flies get deeper. Number 6, fish a thinner butt section leader to get deeper with less weight. If you fish a thicker butt section leader, you're not going to be able to get to the same depth without adding more weight to your system. Number 7, think about the design of your nymphs. Perdigons sink the quickest. Nymphs with a little bit of dubbing or feathers on the body sink a little bit slower. Soft tackled nymphs sink slower still. And then flies with tons of rubber legs or a mop or palmered hackle are the slowest sinking of your nymph categories. Okay. Number 8, the most obvious one, if you need to get shallower or deeper, change your bead size to a lighter or heavier fly. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. That way you'll get notified whenever we make new videos. And then go use these tips on the river. Let us know how they helped you. And then come back on over to tacticalflyfisher.com and we'll help you out with whatever gear you need. Thanks for watching.